Vox AC15c1 is an amp that you are going to see everywhere. It is a mid-level tube amp inspired by classic Vox AC15s, which is a sound that really defined the British rock and roll era in the 1960s. The Vox sound was unlike the sound of other amps, and being made in England at the time, they were used by just about everyone on some very, very influential early rock and roll recordings. This amp, however, can be really finicky. It's a little bit different, and it's certainly off the beaten path compared to other amplifiers you might have played. So today we're going to dial in the Vox AC15c1 many different ways, show you how you can get some cool, unique tones out of it, try on a few pedals with it, and stay tuned to the very end when I am going to turn the amp all the way up on both channels, both the normal and the top boost channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Follow the links below where you can listen to some music, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, the AC15. This is the C1. This is the current basic production model. There's also a C1X. The difference is going to be that the C1 has a Greenback speaker. The C1X has an Alnico Blue speaker, which is more the classic Vox speaker. Now, it's more money because the Alnico Blue speaker costs more. And again, that's more the classic Vox sound. The Greenback, of course, gonna dial in a little bit more crunch with it, which actually suits the amp pretty well, and I will give credit to Vox certainly for a mid-level model coming with a Greenback speaker instead of going the cheaper road like a 7080 or something below that. So it is nice to see these amps having some good speaker options. Tell me, how many of you tuned in because you're not a fan of the AC15 and you're kind of going, they just, I don't like the way they sound, I don't like the way that when I hear them or when I play them, I don't get it. What's the deal? One of the things about this amp, and this is true of a lot of mid-level tube amps, but certainly especially Vox amps in my opinion, they can sound like $1,000,000 or they can sound really bad. And it all depends on how you dial it in, and sometimes it involves dialing it in some unconventional ways, which we're going to talk about in this video. So you just heard a clip of the Stratocaster on the normal channel, and I'm playing a Gibson Les Paul. That was into the top boost channel. Now I'm going to switch back and forth and do a bunch of different tones. We're going to go clean, we're going to go overdriven, we're also going to use pedals as I mentioned, and then at the end we're going to crank each channel so that you can hear what it sounds like. I'll tell you my likes and dislikes about this amp to get started. My likes are that it does have a cool, unique tone, and it's pretty reasonably priced in today's market. They're $699 new for the C1, and you can usually find these used somewhere between $400 and $600. So I like that they're not skimping on the speaker, that even on the lower end model you're getting a good speaker like the Celestion Greenback. I like that it gives you both the normal and the top boost channel. I like that it has the master volume. I like the tremolo, the reverb. They're both nice. The reverb's a little bit, I would like the reverb to be a little bit different, but overall I think it's a high quality reverb, and those are both foot switchable. And lastly, I really like that it has the tone cut. I think that's essential to getting a good tone out of modern Vox amps. Dislikes. One of the things that I'm not crazy about with both the Vox AC15c1 and the Vox AC30c2 is I don't think they fully know what they want to be. They're kind of stuck between two worlds. So like, let's look at Fender as kind of a comparable example. With Fender, you've got your gigging level amps like the Blues series, like your Blues Junior, your Blues Deluxe, and you've got your Hot Rod series. They've also got other ones like the Bass Breakers and certainly other amplifiers. Before you get into a little bit higher level where they get to their vintage reissues, like the Princeton, the Twin Reverb, the Super Reverb, and of course they have their 68 custom line. With Vox amps, Vox has an awful lot of, and I don't even know what the current ones are because I just can't keep track. Vox has a lot of lower end digital modeling amplifiers, and I feel like they keep coming out with a new one that's not really any different than the one that they just had. Then you get into the tube amp line, which has the AC4, you've got the AC10 for your smaller kind of home use ones, maybe some small gigs with an AC10. Then you get into the AC15 and the AC30. Then you get into the hand-wired series. Now the hand-wired is pretty similar in a lot of ways, but it's hand-wired and it comes in the Fawn. I wish that Vox had more modern takes for gig level amplifiers and then more dedicated Vox reissues, right? So even the hand-wired ones. Now for a while Vox made an anniversary hand-wired. They're called the Heritage hand-wired, which were a little bit different than the hand-wired ones they're making now. Those amps were superb. I had one for a while. I had an AC15, the TV front one. That was one of the best amplifiers I've ever played, and I still regret getting rid of it. That was just an absolutely fantastic amp, and it was really a dedicated AC15. It didn't have a master volume. It didn't have any kind of bells and whistles. The modern hand-wired one is kind of just like a spruced up version of this one with a few different features. This one, at the level that it's at, I wish it had more giggable features. Now this one, really the only difference would be that it has the master volume. This one has two channels, but you run one or the other. It's not like it's a channel switching type amp where you have a clean tone and you have a dirty tone. You either run it clean, edge of breakup, you run it some degree, but that's your tone. And then if you want to manipulate that in some way, you use pedals, right? So if you want a clean tone with this amp, you need to run it clean and then use drive pedals to get your drive tone. Now that's fine for a lot of players and that works, but my point is that at this price range, I don't know that it's necessary to be making something that's supposed to be like a vintage reissue. I think it would be more practical to make an amp that has channel switching that would be more of a gig-friendly amplifier for people getting into the Vox sound. One of my dislikes about these Vox amps is the EQ can be a little bit wonky about them. You can remedy this, again, if you're willing to kind of test them out and do it. But when I mentioned to a buddy of mine that I was going to get my hands on an AC15, he said, ugh, yeah, one of my guitar players in my band had that before. It was just so bright all the time. They're very, very bright and they're extremely glassy. Very, very glassy. Now, Fender amps can be glassy too, but I feel like a Fender amp, the glassiness is kind of like going to an old-fashioned demonstration of glass blowing where they're making fine kitchenware and home decor. Vox amp glass is more like John McClane running over the shards of broken glass in his bare feet. You with me? Taming the brightness and taming the glass is key on these amplifiers. They have this very, very even top end response, and then they kind of have this, they actually have, especially on the normal channel, they can have this kind of slightly flubby bass. But that top end, if you don't use the tone cut, it is just so shrill and edgy and kind of loose around the edges, even though it's very, very edgy, and not a particularly refined or pleasing tone. So my number one point of advice on getting a good sound out of this amp is to use the tone cut. That is your friend. You really need to use the tone cut to get a good sound out of this amplifier. Now, what I would suggest along that line, tone cut works opposite of the presence knob. If you turn the presence on an amplifier up, it gets brighter as you turn it up. The tone cut works the opposite. With it all the way off, it's super bright. With it all the way up, it's super warm and kind of muddy. So what I would say is to think about dialing it in opposite. So turn it all the way up first. Now it's going to be pretty muffled and muddy at that point. Then dial it back just up to where you need it. If you ever hear a Vox that's just, they're probably not using the tone cut enough. And one of the reasons that I mentioned that I like that this amp has the tone cut is because there are several Vox amps that don't have the tone cut, like the AC30S1, like the AC10, and without that tone cut, it's just too much, and you really need to just be totally laying on your guitar's volume knob. I remember playing live with an AC30 at the Stone Church in Newmarket, New Hampshire, many years ago, and I was using my AC30 with a 50 style Strat that was very bright, and I hadn't used that rig live before, and I could not believe that even with the tone cut over halfway up, I had my Strat's tone knob rolled off to about 4, and that's where it really sounded good. So just be aware that these amps get super bright. I'll never run these amps with a tone cut below 12 o'clock. Now it also depends on how loud you are, and I am going to bring up one more like about this amp. At 15 watts, but with this bright tone, it's a very giggable amp. Is it loud enough for some gigs? That's hard to say, and it depends on your needs. If you need a lot of clean headroom, no, it's probably not loud enough for a lot of gigs. One of the things that I like about it at 15 watts, and it's an EL84 amp, is that you can get it to the point where the power tubes are warming up and really filling out at a lot of gig volumes, which makes it sound richer. At a certain point, it starts compressing nightly, and that's when those kind of flubby, bright, edgy edges start rounding off, and it really sounds like a cool vintage AC15. That's when you get the great tones out of this one. Now, that being said, it can also sound really nice, clean, again, if you use that tone cut and if you use the tremolo and the reverb. So let's dive back in here with some clean tones. You're going to hear the Stratocaster playing into the top boost channel for a really pretty clean. And then to get a jazzy, kind of bluesy, jazzy tone, I'm going to use the Les Paul into the normal channel with a tone cut almost all the way up. So let's hear some clean tones from the AC15. right, now for some drive tones. Believe it or not, this is actually a great blues amp, again, if you know how to dial it in. So with the Les Paul, I'm going to go into the normal channel with the normal channel volume all the way up, not the master volume. We're going to open the amp wide up later on. Remember that the volumes basically are like gain knobs, and the master volume is like your volume knob. Now, some players will tell you that they really like turning the master volume all the way up and then using the volume on each channel as a dedicated volume knob. I'm not crazy about that method, and I'll tell you why. The number one reason is because I find it runs really noisy that way. And especially if you're getting some kind of a cleanish tone, if you're running it really wide open and overdriven, it's almost like a moot point, the noise. But if you're going for a clean tone, I found that they're pretty noisy if you just turn the master volume all the way up and then use the volume knobs as volume knobs. So that's why I don't do that. I like to use the master volume to blend into a certain level of grit, whether it's a little bit or whether it's a lot. Now, it does do the edge of breakup thing pretty well, like you heard at the beginning with the Stratocaster going into the normal channel. Especially if you ride your volume on your guitar a little bit, you can get some nice cleanish tones if you're picking lightly, and then if you dig in and use your volume, you can just really get some cool tones. Of course, then you can also boost it with a pedal on top of that. For now, we're going to go into the normal channel with the normal channel's volume gain turned all the way up for some cool bluesy tones on this Les Paul. Then we're going to go to the top boost channel with the Stratocaster. Here's where we're talking about getting some unique tones. Top boost channel can sound superb. With the AC30, the CC2, when I used to play that, I remember the literature used to say that the treble and the bass were interactive. So if you turned them up, you'd get a slight mid scoop. If you started to turn them back, you'd get a bump in the mids. So I had this idea, well, let's turn the treble and the bass all the way off and just run on this really mid-rangey rich signal. What would that sound like? Well, it didn't give me this massive mid-range bump like I expected it would, but it sounded awesome. It sounded really, really cool. And this amp is no different. If you're into the top boost channel, you can get a really cool tone if you turn the treble and the bass all the way off. That's what you heard with this guitar in the opening clip. When I was playing the Les Paul into it, I was playing it into the top boost channel. I had the treble and the bass turned off, and I had the tone cut up at about, I want to say, 2 or 3 o'clock-ish. And it just sounds awesome because it takes away some of those frequencies that get flubby and edgy, but it doesn't lose its brightness. It doesn't fully lose its bottom end, because I don't want to say it gives the mid-range this crazy, crazy boost or bump, but it makes it more present and clear. It's almost like the treble and the bass were getting in the way of the really rich mid-range frequencies. So we're going to hear this going into the normal channel turned all the way up, and then we're going to play the Stratocaster into the top boost channel with the treble and the bass all the way off. Check out how great these drive tones sound into the AC15. Now, before we try out some pedals and then close out the video with some wide open amp tones, I do want to show off the tremolo and the reverb because, again, the tremolo is really great. I love the tremolo on this amp. The reverb is nice. It has a nice tone. The interesting thing is it kind of sits in the background, oddly. Now, you can turn the reverb up pretty high and not have it just totally, like, wash you out, which is cool. So if you want a really atmospheric tone, you can get that, but your guitar signal still has a lot of fidelity. It's kind of long, and it has a little bit of a mid-rangey swell to to it, which is not the best I've ever heard, but again, for an amp this level, this is one of the better reverbs I think that's out there. So now let's hear it with the tremolo and the reverb. Okay, earlier on when I was talking about likes and dislikes, I mentioned running this amp, and if you want to run it clean or an edge of breakup and then want a richer tone, you really need pedals because it's not a channel switching amp. You're really reliant on external effects to get a lot of different tones or to make it more gig friendly. This is actually okay because Vox amps traditionally would be known with some other sound attached to them. Many of the classic Vox amp tones that you're listening to on recordings are modified in some way. Either the player was using pedals or they were modified in the studio. So we're going to try out a few different pedals to see if we can get some different tones here. First, I'm going to start with an overdrive. I'm using a Shnobel Tone Daily Drive, which is a great overdrive pedal, just to show you how well it takes overdrives. Next, I want to do two different rhythm tones, and I'm going to use a compressor for this. Because it has those kind of flubby edges like I mentioned, a compressor goes a long way in tightening this amp up and giving a little bit of bounce to it, and just kind of, it gives it a little bit more sag, but then tightens the notes up. So for this, I'm using a one control pale blue compressor. Now I'm cheating a little bit because this also, the pale blue compressor also has a 3-band EQ. It's a great compressor. I'm going to do two different British Invasion style rhythm tones here, just kind of inspired by, I'm not going for a specific tone, but you'll hear, I think, if you use a compressor into this amp, it gives you that, more of that jangly rhythmic tone that you would think of from the British Invasion. I'm not just talking about the Beatles. I know a lot of people's mind immediately goes to the Beatles being Vox users, but like I said, many bands in that era used Vox amps. So we're going to try it out with a compressor. I'm going into the top boost channel. I'm going to start with it a little bit lighter at first, and then I'm going to give the amp a little bit more drive, a little bit more treble, and turn the compressor up for the second tone. So here are two different rhythm tones using the compressor. All right, now for the last pedal set, I'm actually going to double up two pedals together here. One of the classic Vox tones, more with the AC30, but would have been the Rangemaster treble booster. So I happen to have a Tru-Fi Rangemaster, which is an excellent treble booster made from a company right here in Maine, and I'm using that. So I'm going to show you how you can get a cool tone using the Rangemaster going into this to get that kind of vintage cranked Voxy tone, and it gives it a different responsiveness to the drive. And I'm also going to double that up with a Keeley Eccos for some delay. So check out this great lead tone that you can get using a treble booster and a delay. To close out here, we are going to get this amp wide open. I'm going to play the Stratocaster into the normal channel. I'm going to play the Les Paul into the top boost channel. Now, because having the treble and bass all the way off is a little bit outside the box, so to speak, they're still going to be slightly shy of noon, but I am going to get those controls up a little bit using the Les Paul, and still pretty liberally using the tone cut for each of them. Now you'll hear the normal channel actually stays pretty dynamic. The normal channel doesn't really get that rip-roaring, particularly with the Stratocaster. Sounds very nice, still cleans up pretty well just based on your pick attack. The top boost channel is where you really get the crunch in it. You get a nice crunch again, especially if you're willing to use that tone cut. So to close it out, let's hear the amp totally wide open. Let us know in the comments if you are an AC15 user, if you know people who have one, if it's one that you've thought about, that you see a lot of them on the used markets normally. You'll see people wanting to sell them or trade them, pick them up again, and it's just an amp that's really common, and if you ever come across one, just know that you can dial in some really, really cool tones if you are willing to take some time with it. And remember to use your ears and not your expectations. If it's not giving you the sound that you want, dial it in differently until it is. It doesn't matter what level the knobs are at. It doesn't matter if one knob is totally cranked or totally turned off. Dial it in the way it sounds good to you. And on that note, I do want to mention just before we close out here that any of the settings that I have on this, take these as a starting point, because these are what work for me in my context with my guitars and my playing, and also right here in the room. Like for instance, I might have the tone cut turned up a little bit more than you might for a gig, because I'm here playing by myself. If you're at a gig, you might need a little bit more of that treble to cut through if you have other people playing with you. So again, use them as a starting point. Hopefully it just gives you some cool ideas on how you can dial it in. So I hope you enjoyed these last tones. I'm Jack Fossett. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Follow those links below to listen to some music. And here's the AC15c1 wide open.